Tonight's story takes us back to the winter of 1945, to a quiet hillside community in Fayette County, West Virginia, where a family home stood surrounded by the stillness of the Appalachian landscape. It was Christmas Eve, a night usually marked by warmth, celebration, and the gentle rhythm of family traditions. Inside the house, children were awake later than usual, enjoying the excitement of the holiday season, while parents settled into the comfort of familiar routines. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would soon become the beginning of one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. Before the night was over, a fire would consume the home, leaving behind devastation, uncertainty, and questions that would echo across decades. In the hours that followed, confusion and urgency mixed with disbelief, as family members struggled to understand what had happened. When the flames were finally extinguished, the official explanation seemed straightforward at first. Yet for those closest to the event, certain details did not sit comfortably within that conclusion. The absence of clear answers would create a lasting sense of doubt that time could not easily resolve. The Sodder family were known within their community as hardworking, independent, and deeply connected to one another. Their lives were shaped by ordinary responsibilities, shared meals, and the rhythms of family life that many people recognize. Because of this, the events that unfolded felt even more difficult to accept. Tragedy alone can be overwhelming, but uncertainty layered on top of loss can create questions that linger far longer than the moment itself. Over the years, memories of that night remained vivid, shaped by what was seen, what was heard, and what could never be fully explained. As the decades passed, the story continued to surface in conversations, investigations, and public curiosity. Reports, possible sightings, and alternative explanations emerged, each adding another layer to an already complex situation. Some details appeared to offer hope, while others deepened confusion. What remained constant was the determination of family members to seek understanding, even when official answers seemed final. The persistence of that search became part of the story itself. As you settle in, allow the atmosphere to become calm and steady. This is not a story told with urgency, but with quiet attention to the details that are known and the uncertainties that remain. We will move gently through the timeline, following the events as they unfolded and the reflections that followed in the years afterward. Some mysteries do not resolve easily, and tonight we simply allow this one to exist as it is, resting within memory as the night continues. In the mid-1940s, West Virginia was a place shaped by industry, landscape, and close-knit communities. Coal mining and related trades formed the economic backbone of many towns, and families often built their lives around hard physical work and mutual support. The Appalachian terrain created both beauty and isolation, with homes sometimes spread across hillsides and rural roads that wound through valleys. In communities like Fayetteville, neighbors often knew one another well, and daily life followed rhythms influenced by work schedules, church gatherings, and seasonal traditions. The Sodder family lived within this environment, creating a life that combined work, ambition, and strong family bonds. The parents, George and Jenny Sodder, had built their household through years of effort. George operated a trucking business that transported coal and materials, allowing the family to achieve a level of stability and comfort compared with many others in the region. Their home stood on a hillside overlooking the surrounding area, visible from nearby roads and familiar to local residents who passed by regularly. The family included several children, ranging in age from young to nearly grown. Household life was active and often busy, filled with school responsibilities, chores, and shared meals. The children attended local schools, formed friendships within the community, and participated in everyday routines typical of families in the area. Jenny managed the household, caring for the children and maintaining a sense of order within a large family structure. Their home was a place of activity, laughter, and occasional disagreements, reflecting ordinary family dynamics. George Sodder was known as a determined and outspoken individual. As an immigrant who had worked to establish himself in the United States, he carried strong opinions about world events and political issues, particularly those connected to his homeland of Italy. These views sometimes led to conversations or disagreements within the community, though such exchanges were not uncommon during a time marked by global conflict and shifting alliances. Despite occasional tensions, George remained integrated within local business and social networks. The Sodder home itself was relatively large compared with many rural houses of the time. It had been expanded over the years as the family grew, reflecting both practical needs and the family's financial progress. Electricity had been installed, along with other conveniences that were not universal in rural areas during that period. The house stood as a symbol of the family's efforts and aspirations, representing stability achieved through work and persistence. Daily routines in the household followed predictable patterns. Mornings involved preparing children for school and organizing tasks for the day. Evenings brought the family back together for meals and conversation, often around the kitchen or living spaces that served as gathering points. Weekends and holidays added moments of celebration, particularly during the winter season when Christmas traditions held special importance. Decorations, gifts, and shared excitement created an atmosphere that children eagerly anticipated each year. Within the community, the family was generally recognized and known. George's business brought him into contact with many people, and the children interacted with neighbors and classmates regularly. This familiarity would later play a role in how events were perceived, as community members responded not to strangers, but to a family they recognized personally. The social connections surrounding the Sodders formed part of the broader context in which the later tragedy unfolded. The year 1945 also carried historical significance beyond the local community. The Second World War was nearing its end, and American families were adjusting to changes that followed years of global conflict. Economic conditions were shifting, and communities were beginning to transition into a post-war period. These broader circumstances formed a backdrop against which everyday life continued, including within the Sodder household. Understanding the environment in which the family lived helps illuminate how ordinary the days leading up to Christmas Eve appeared. There were no clear indicators that anything unusual was about to occur. The routines, relationships, and surroundings were familiar, grounded in the stability the family had worked to create. This sense of normality would later contrast sharply with the events that unfolded, deepening the impact felt by both the family and the wider community. At this point in time, the Sodder family existed simply as one household among many, living through the rhythms of rural American life in the 1940s. The home stood quietly on its hillside, illuminated by the anticipation of the holiday season, with no awareness that it would soon become the center of a mystery that would endure for generations. On the evening of December 24th, 1945, the Sodder household carried the familiar atmosphere of Christmas anticipation. The day had unfolded, much like many others during the holiday season, with preparations, errands, and small moments of excitement shared among the children. Inside the home, decorations and seasonal activity created a sense of warmth that contrasted with the winter air outside. It was a time when routines were slightly relaxed, allowing the children to stay awake later than usual and enjoy the anticipation of Christmas morning. That evening, several of the children gathered in the living areas of the house, playing with toys and talking among themselves while their parents settled into the quieter rhythm of the night. Jenny Sodder, who had spent much of the day managing household tasks, eventually prepared to rest. George Sodder also retired for the evening, expecting the house to gradually become quiet as the children followed. However, some of the younger members of the family asked permission to remain awake longer, wanting to enjoy their holiday excitement. This request was not unusual, and they were allowed to continue playing after their parents went to bed. The household at that point included both children who had gone upstairs to sleep and others who remained downstairs. The separation of family members across different areas of the house reflected the normal layout of nightly routines. Some lights remained on, and the sounds of movement and conversation continued quietly while the night progressed. Outside, the surrounding hillside community was calm, with neighbors also settling into their homes during the late hours of Christmas Eve. At some point during the night, Jenny Sodder received a telephone call that would later become an important detail in recollections of the evening. The caller was reportedly a woman asking for someone whose name Jenny did not recognize. There was unfamiliar laughter in the background, and the tone of the conversation felt unusual. Jenny ended the call and returned to bed, thinking little more about it at the time. The house remained quiet, and no immediate concerns were apparent. Later, as Jenny prepared to sleep again, she noticed that some lights in the home were still on and that the doors were not fully secured. She moved through parts of the house to check conditions, eventually returning upstairs. These small observations would later take on greater significance in memory, though at the time they appeared to be ordinary details of a household settling for the night. The children who had remained awake were believed to still be downstairs when the parents went to sleep. The calm of the evening continued for a period of time. The surrounding area remained still, with no indication that anything unusual was developing. The Sodder home stood, as it always had, quietly overlooking the landscape. Inside, family members were asleep or resting, with the expectation that morning would bring celebration and the opening of gifts. The routine comfort of Christmas Eve carried forward into the late hours without interruption. In retrospect, this portion of the timeline holds particular importance because it represents the final period of normalcy before events changed dramatically. Every household action, from turning off lights to allowing children to remain awake, would later be recalled and examined. Yet during those moments, they were simply part of everyday family life, unfolding without concern. As midnight passed and the house grew quieter, the night seemed to move toward its usual conclusion. The anticipation of Christmas morning remained the central focus, with no awareness among family members that the coming hours would bring confusion, urgency, and questions that would persist long after the holiday had passed. In the early hours of Christmas morning, shortly after midnight had passed into December 25th, Jenny Sodder was awakened by the smell of smoke. At first, the sensation was faint, the kind of smell that might momentarily register before the mind fully recognizes its meaning. But within moments, the presence of smoke became more noticeable, prompting her to leave her bed and move through the house to investigate. What she discovered would transform the quiet holiday night into a moment of urgency and confusion. As Jenny reached the area near the office portion of the home, she saw flames beginning to spread along the wall and ceiling. The fire appeared to be concentrated in one section initially, but it was already growing. Recognizing the danger, she immediately called out to alert the rest of the household. George Sodder was awakened, and together they began attempting to gather the children who were upstairs. The priority in those first moments was simple and instinctive: wake everyone and get outside as quickly as possible. Several of the children responded quickly to the alarm. They were guided down the stairs and out of the house into the cold night air, some still disoriented from being awakened suddenly. The hillside surroundings, dark and quiet just moments earlier, were now illuminated by the glow of flames beginning to spread through the structure. The urgency of the situation became clear as smoke thickened and visibility inside the home began to diminish. George and Jenny soon realized that not all of their children were accounted for. 5 of the younger children had last been known to be sleeping or resting downstairs earlier in the night. The parents attempted to call out to them, hoping for a response, but the growing fire made re-entry increasingly dangerous. Flames were spreading more rapidly, and the structure of the house was beginning to fill with smoke. The combination of heat and visibility made it difficult to navigate inside. George attempted several methods to reach the children who remained unaccounted for. One effort involved trying to use equipment from his trucking business to access upper portions of the home. However, mechanical issues prevented this approach from working as intended. Time was passing quickly, and the fire continued to intensify. The sense of urgency was accompanied by helplessness, as the parents searched for any possible way to reach the missing children. Attempts were also made to contact emergency services. The family tried to reach the local fire department by telephone, but communication difficulties delayed direct contact. In rural communities during that period, emergency response systems were not always immediate, and calls often required relay through local operators or neighbors. As a result, the arrival of assistance would take longer than hoped. Neighbors began noticing the fire as the glow grew brighter against the night sky. Some residents moved toward the scene to offer help where possible, though the intensity of the flames limited what anyone could safely do. The house, constructed with materials common for the time, was highly vulnerable once the fire had taken hold. Within a relatively short period, the structure became engulfed. For the Sodder parents and the children who had escaped, the scene was overwhelming. They stood outside watching the home burn, calling out for those still missing, hoping for some sign that they had managed to escape unnoticed. The uncertainty of those moments created a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. The expectation that the missing children might emerge at any moment persisted, even as the flames continued to consume the structure. As the fire progressed, it became clear that immediate rescue attempts were no longer possible. The focus shifted toward waiting for emergency responders and hoping for any outcome that might clarify what had happened. The quiet Christmas night had transformed into a scene of destruction, with flames lighting the hillside and smoke rising into the cold air. These first moments of discovery and reaction would later remain deeply embedded in memory. The sequence of waking, realizing the presence of fire, gathering some children and searching for others, unfolded rapidly. Yet each detail would later be recalled repeatedly in attempts to understand the events of that night. The urgency, confusion, and helplessness experienced during those minutes marked the beginning of a mystery that would extend far beyond the immediate tragedy. As the fire continued to spread through the Sodder home, the urgency of the situation was matched by the growing awareness that outside assistance had not yet arrived. In rural West Virginia during the 1940s, emergency response systems were far more limited than they are today. Local fire departments often relied on volunteer crews, and communication depended on telephone connections that were not always immediate or reliable. These conditions contributed to delays that felt especially long during a rapidly developing emergency. The family and nearby neighbors made repeated attempts to contact the fire department. Calls were placed through local operators, and word was also sent through individuals who traveled toward town to notify authorities directly. Each passing minute increased the intensity of the fire, and the house became more fully engulfed. Flames spread from room to room, fueled by the wooden structure and interior materials typical of homes built during that era. The hillside setting, combined with the cold winter air, created conditions where the fire burned with visible force against the night sky. George Sodder continued searching for any possible way to reach the children who remained unaccounted for. One idea involved using heavy equipment from his trucking business to access the upper areas of the home, but mechanical difficulties prevented the vehicle from functioning as expected. The equipment that might have provided access could not be used, leaving few options for rescue. The fire had progressed to a point where entering the structure was no longer possible without extreme danger. Neighbors gathered as the scene unfolded, some attempting to assist where they could, others offering support to the family members who had escaped. The emotional intensity of the moment affected everyone present. The glow of the burning house illuminated the hillside, creating a stark contrast with the surrounding darkness. The sounds of collapsing materials and crackling flames replaced the quiet stillness that had existed earlier in the night. Eventually, local fire responders arrived, but by that time the house had already suffered catastrophic damage. Their efforts focused on controlling what remained of the blaze and preventing it from spreading further. With much of the structure already destroyed, the role of responders shifted from rescue to containment. Water was applied to remaining flames, and firefighters worked to ensure that no surrounding areas would ignite. As the fire subsided, the remains of the house were left as a smoldering framework of debris. The speed with which the structure had been consumed surprised many observers. Wooden beams, roofing materials, and interior furnishings had collapsed inward, creating a pile of ash and fragments where rooms had once stood. The transformation from family home to ruins had occurred within a matter of hours. For the Sodder family, the destruction carried both emotional and practical consequences. Their home, possessions, and sense of security had been lost, and the uncertainty surrounding the missing children added a deeper layer of distress. Standing near the remains in the early morning hours, they faced the reality that the night had brought irreversible change. The anticipation of Christmas had been replaced by confusion and grief. Community members who witnessed the aftermath also struggled to process what had happened. Fires were not unheard of in rural areas, but the scale and speed of this event left a strong impression. The image of the hillside home reduced to ashes became part of local memory, discussed in the days that followed as people tried to understand how such destruction had occurred so quickly. The destruction of the house marked a turning point in the timeline. What had begun as a sudden emergency had ended with a complete loss of the structure and continued uncertainty about the fate of the missing children. As daylight approached and smoke continued to rise from the debris, attention began to shift toward what remained and what might be discovered within the ruins. As daylight began to spread across the hillside on the morning of December 25th, the full extent of the destruction became visible. Where the Sodder home had stood only hours earlier, there was now a mass of ash, debris, and collapsed structural remains. Smoke still rose in thin streams from the site, and the air carried the lingering smell of burned wood and household materials. For the family and those gathered nearby, the morning brought both clarity and renewed uncertainty, as attention turned toward what might be found within the ruins. George Sodder and others approached the remains carefully, hoping to locate any sign of the 5 children who had not been accounted for during the night. The search was difficult because much of the structure had collapsed inward, leaving layers of debris that were unstable and still warm. The materials of the house, including roofing, furniture, and interior walls, had combined into a dense mass that made identification challenging. Early efforts focused on visually scanning the surface and moving smaller fragments where possible. Local authorities and community members assisted in examining the site. Given the resources available at the time, the search process was relatively basic compared with modern investigative methods. Equipment for detailed forensic analysis was limited, and the primary approach involved manual inspection of debris. Observers expected that if the children had remained inside during the fire, physical evidence would likely be discovered among the remains. This expectation shaped the early conclusions reached during the initial examination. As hours passed, no clear human remains were identified within the debris. The absence of obvious findings created uncertainty for the family. Some officials suggested that the intensity of the fire could have destroyed evidence to a degree that made recovery difficult, while others continued to search carefully for any fragments that might provide confirmation. The situation highlighted the challenges of interpreting fire scenes, particularly when destruction is extensive. The family's emotional state during this period was complex. Grief, shock, and hope coexisted, influenced by the uncertainty of what the search might reveal. The absence of clear evidence created space for questions, even as officials leaned toward conclusions based on typical fire outcomes. The parents and surviving children remained close to the site, watching and waiting as examination continued throughout the day. Practical considerations also emerged as attention turned toward safety and recovery. Debris needed to cool before deeper examination could occur, and the stability of the collapsed structure limited how much material could be moved immediately. The combination of heat, ash, and structural collapse meant that the search process could not proceed quickly. Each step required caution to avoid injury and further disturbance of the remains. Community members who visited the site observed the contrast between what had existed before and what remained now. The hillside setting, once familiar, appeared altered by the absence of the house and the presence of charred debris. Conversations among neighbors reflected both sympathy for the family and attempts to understand the event. Fires were not uncommon in rural communities, but the lack of clear findings regarding the missing children added an unusual dimension to the situation. By the end of the day, attention began shifting toward official evaluation of the fire and its consequences. Authorities prepared to document observations and determine likely causes, while the family continued to process the absence of definitive answers. The morning search had not produced the clarity that many expected, leaving questions that would soon grow more significant in the days and years ahead. The events of that morning marked the beginning of a longer period of investigation and reflection. The remains of the home represented both physical loss and unresolved uncertainty, setting the stage for official conclusions and family doubts that would emerge as the story continued to unfold. In the days following the fire, attention shifted toward determining how the tragedy had occurred and what conclusions could be drawn from the remains of the home. Local authorities, including fire officials and investigators, examined the site to establish a likely cause. Given the era and the resources available, the investigation relied heavily on visual inspection, witness accounts, and general knowledge of how residential fires typically behaved. Detailed forensic analysis, as understood today, was not widely available at that time, particularly in rural communities. Initial assessments focused on the possibility of an electrical origin. The Sodder home had electrical wiring installed, and officials considered whether a malfunction or fault could have sparked the fire. Electrical fires were not uncommon in homes of that period, especially where wiring systems had been modified or expanded over time. Based on the observations made during the early examination, authorities concluded that the fire was most likely accidental, consistent with common causes seen in similar incidents. Regarding the missing children, officials expressed the belief that they had likely perished within the fire. The intensity of the blaze and the collapse of the structure were cited as factors that could explain the absence of clearly identifiable remains. It was suggested that extreme heat might have destroyed physical evidence to a degree that made recovery difficult. This explanation aligned with general assumptions about severe residential fires, and the conclusion was accepted by authorities as the most probable scenario. Documentation of the event reflected these findings. Reports indicated that the fire had destroyed the home rapidly, and that the missing children were presumed to have been inside when the structure burned. With the official cause classified as accidental, there was no indication of criminal investigation beyond routine procedures. For authorities, the case appeared to be a tragic but explainable event, and attention began to shift toward recovery and closure. However, not all aspects of the situation were entirely straightforward. Certain details raised quiet questions, even in the early stages. The speed with which the house had burned and the absence of identifiable remains created uncertainty for some observers, though these concerns did not alter the official conclusion. Investigations at that time often relied on practical judgment rather than extensive laboratory analysis, and the determination of accidental fire was considered reasonable based on available information. For the Sodder family, the official conclusions did not provide the sense of certainty they hoped for. The parents struggled to reconcile the absence of physical evidence with the assumption that their children had perished. Emotional distress, combined with lingering questions about the events of the night, creating doubt that would persist beyond the immediate aftermath. While authorities moved toward closure, the family's perspective remained unsettled. Community response reflected a mixture of acceptance and sympathy. Many neighbors trusted the official explanation, recognizing that fires could behave unpredictably and cause severe destruction. At the same time, the tragedy itself left a strong emotional impact. The loss of a home and the presumed loss of children on Christmas morning created a sense of sorrow that extended beyond the family to the wider community. Administrative processes followed the official determination. Documentation of the incident was completed, and the site was gradually left to settle as debris cooled and time passed. From an institutional standpoint, the event had been investigated according to the standards of the period, and no further action appeared necessary. The case, in official terms, was considered resolved. Yet for the Sodder family, resolution did not feel complete. Questions remained about the events leading up to the fire, the missing children, and the absence of evidence. These doubts would soon grow into a sustained effort to seek answers beyond the initial investigation. The early official conclusions, therefore, marked not an ending, but the beginning of a longer search for understanding that would continue for many years. In the weeks and months after the fire, the Sodder family struggled to accept the official explanation that the missing children had perished within the house. Grief was present, but it was accompanied by uncertainty that did not fade with time. George and Jenny Sodder began revisiting details of the night repeatedly, reflecting on what they had seen, heard, and experienced. As they did so, certain aspects of the event appeared inconsistent to them, raising questions that felt difficult to ignore. One of the earliest sources of doubt involved the absence of identifiable human remains within the debris. The parents found it hard to reconcile this with the assumption that 5 children had been inside during a fire intense enough to destroy the house, while officials suggested that extreme heat could account for the lack of recovery. The family questioned whether that explanation fully matched what they observed at the site. The uncertainty surrounding physical evidence became one of the central reasons they continued to believe something else might have occurred. The parents also reflected on events that had taken place before the fire, recalling moments that had seemed minor at the time but now appeared more significant. Conversations with individuals in the community, unfamiliar visitors, and unusual occurrences around the property were reconsidered through the lens of what had happened. These recollections did not immediately provide answers, but they contributed to a growing sense that the situation might not be as straightforward as authorities believed. George Sodder's personality and experiences also influenced how he approached the situation. Known as determined and persistent, he was not inclined to accept conclusions that felt incomplete. His willingness to question official findings led him to gather information independently. Speaking with neighbors, reviewing timelines, and considering possibilities that extended beyond accidental fire. Jenny shared this determination, motivated by the emotional bond with her children and the need for certainty about their fate. As time passed, small pieces of information began to circulate that seemed to support the possibility of unanswered questions. Comments from community members, observations about the fire scene, and recollections of events leading up to the night contributed to the family's doubts. Some of these details were difficult to verify, while others were open to interpretation. Nevertheless, they reinforced the parents' belief that further investigation might be necessary. The emotional impact of uncertainty differed from that of confirmed loss. Without clear evidence, hope and doubt could coexist, creating a state of unresolved grief. The family's search for understanding became intertwined with the desire to believe that their children might still be alive. This possibility, however uncertain, prevented emotional closure and encouraged continued inquiry. Community reactions varied. Some neighbors sympathized with the family's concerns and supported their efforts to seek answers. Others accepted the official explanation and viewed the doubts as a natural response to tragedy, rather than evidence of alternative events. These differing perspectives created a social environment in which the family's questions remained present, but not universally accepted. Practical actions followed the emergence of doubt. George Sodder began documenting observations and exploring avenues that might clarify what had happened. Conversations with officials continued, though they did not always produce new information. The parents' persistence reflected both emotional need and genuine curiosity about details that appeared unresolved. Over time, the family's doubts evolved into a sustained effort to understand the events of that night. The absence of certainty became the defining feature of their experience, shaping decisions and actions in the years that followed. What began as personal uncertainty gradually transformed into a broader search for answers, drawing attention beyond the immediate community. The emergence of these questions marked an important turning point in the story. The tragedy was no longer viewed solely as a house fire, but as an event with unresolved elements. The family's determination to pursue understanding would soon lead them toward reports, sightings, and investigations that extended far beyond the original incident, keeping the mystery alive across decades. As the months passed after the fire, the possibility that the missing children might still be alive began to take shape through reported sightings and statements from individuals who believed they had seen them. Some of these reports came from people who had heard about the tragedy and later connected memories or encounters to the case. Others came from individuals who claimed to have observed children matching similar descriptions in locations outside West Virginia. For the Sodder family, each report carried the potential for hope, even as uncertainty remained. One of the earliest accounts involved a woman who believed she had seen children resembling the missing Sodder siblings shortly after the fire, traveling with adults in a vehicle. Over time, additional reports emerged from more distant locations. Some individuals claimed to have encountered children or young people who spoke about circumstances that seemed unusual or connected to the case. In certain instances, people reported hearing names or stories that reminded them of the Sodder children after they learned about the disappearance through newspapers or community discussions. The combination of publicity and memory made it challenging to determine whether reports were based on genuine observation or retrospective association. Investigating these sightings presented practical difficulties. Communication systems in the 1940s were limited compared with modern technology, and verifying identities across different regions required time and resources. Authorities often lacked the ability to confirm whether individuals described in reports were actually connected to the case. Without photographic comparison tools or national databases, confirmation relied heavily on personal identification, which could be unreliable over distance and time. For the Sodder family, the emotional impact of these reports was significant. Each potential sighting created a moment of renewed hope, followed by uncertainty when verification proved inconclusive. The cycle of hope and disappointment became part of their experience, reinforcing both determination and frustration. The possibility that their children might still exist somewhere prevented closure, encouraging continued attention to any new information that surfaced. Authorities faced challenges in evaluating reports as well. With no confirmed evidence contradicting the original conclusion, many investigators treated sightings cautiously. Some reports were explored to the extent possible, while others lacked sufficient detail to pursue further. The absence of consistent, verifiable information made it difficult to establish a clear direction for investigation. Over time, the accumulation of unconfirmed reports contributed to the complexity of the case rather than resolving it. Public awareness of the disappearance also influenced the emergence of reports. As news of the tragedy spread, people across different communities became aware of the missing children. This visibility increased the likelihood that individuals might interpret unrelated encounters as connected to the case. Memory, Perception and publicity combined to create situations where reports could arise without reliable evidence to support them. Despite these challenges, the family continued collecting information, documenting accounts, and exploring possibilities. Their persistence reflected both emotional commitment and the belief that answers might still exist. Some reports seemed promising enough to warrant travel or further inquiry, even when outcomes remained uncertain. The process became part of a long-term search rather than a single investigation. The difficulty of verification became one of the defining features of this stage of the story. Reports offered potential leads, but without confirmation they remained possibilities rather than facts. The lack of clear evidence allowed multiple interpretations to exist simultaneously, sustaining both hope and mystery. Over time, the accumulation of sightings would become part of the broader narrative surrounding the disappearance, illustrating how uncertainty can persist when definitive answers remain out of reach. As the years passed without clear answers, the Sodder family gradually shifted from relying on official conclusions toward pursuing their own independent efforts to understand what had happened. George and Jenny Sodder remained convinced that the absence of physical evidence and the reports they had received justified continued investigation. Their determination became a central part of the story, shaping how the case would be remembered and discussed over time. One of the most visible aspects of their efforts involved public appeals for information. The family created large billboards displaying photographs of the missing children, along with details of the disappearance, placing them along highways where passing motorists could see them. These displays served both as a call for assistance and as a statement that the family had not accepted the official explanation. The images of the children, preserved in photographs taken before the fire, became symbolic reminders of the unanswered questions surrounding the case. In addition to public signage, the family maintained ongoing communication with individuals who claimed to have information. Letters arrived from various parts of the country, some offering possible sightings and others suggesting theories about what might have occurred. George carefully reviewed many of these communications, responding when he believed there might be useful information. While most leads did not result in confirmed findings, the process demonstrated the family's commitment to exploring every possibility. The parents also sought assistance from private investigators at different points, hoping that independent inquiry might uncover details overlooked during the initial investigation. These efforts sometimes involved traveling to locations connected to reported sightings or following up on specific claims made by witnesses. The work required financial resources and emotional endurance, as each new lead carried both hope and uncertainty. The willingness to invest time and effort reflected the depth of the parents' belief that answers might still exist. Community response to these efforts varied. Some individuals supported the family's persistence, viewing it as an understandable reaction to unresolved tragedy. Others questioned whether continued investigation would provide clarity after so much time had passed. Regardless of differing opinions, the family's determination kept public attention focused on the case, ensuring that the disappearance remained part of regional awareness rather than fading entirely from memory. Media coverage occasionally revisited the story, particularly when new developments or claims emerged. Newspapers and broadcasters reported on the family's appeals, presenting the case as an enduring mystery. This coverage extended the reach of the family's search beyond their immediate community, increasing the number of people who might recognize the children or provide information. Public awareness became an important tool in the ongoing effort to find answers. The emotional dimension of these independent efforts remained significant. For the parents, continuing the search represented both hope and responsibility. The possibility that their children might still be alive created motivation that did not diminish with time. Even as years passed, the uncertainty prevented closure, reinforcing the need to keep asking questions and seeking information. Over time, the billboards and public appeals became part of the landscape associated with the case. Travelers passing through the region would see the images and read the details, carrying the story with them to other places. The visibility of the appeals contributed to the enduring nature of the mystery, ensuring that the disappearance remained present in public consciousness long after the original event. The independent efforts undertaken by the Sodder family therefore extended the life of the investigation beyond official channels. Their persistence transformed the story from a concluded tragedy into an ongoing search for truth. The combination of public appeals, private inquiry, and continued attention created a legacy that would carry forward into later decades, shaping how the case continued to be remembered and explored. As the years moved forward, the disappearance of the Sodder children remained unresolved, prompting occasional reviews and reassessments of the available information. Although the original investigation had concluded that the children had likely perished in the fire, the family's continued doubts and the absence of definitive physical evidence kept questions alive. Over time, new perspectives emerged as individuals revisited the case, examining details with fresh attention and considering whether earlier conclusions had been reached too quickly. One area of reassessment involved the behavior of residential fires and the likelihood of remains being completely destroyed. Some observers questioned whether the intensity and duration of the fire was sufficient to account for the absence of identifiable evidence. While experts offered differing views on this subject, the uncertainty contributed to ongoing debate. The question was not easily resolved, particularly because the original scene had long since changed, and detailed forensic analysis was limited by the investigative methods of the 1940s. Additional consideration was given to reports and observations that had surfaced in the years following the incident. Some of these accounts were re-examined in light of later information, while others remained difficult to verify due to the passage of time. Memory, perception, and incomplete documentation made it challenging to establish reliable conclusions. Even when certain details appeared suggestive, they rarely provided confirmation strong enough to alter the official understanding of the event. At different points, individuals outside the immediate family expressed interest in the case, including journalists, researchers, and private investigators. Their involvement sometimes brought renewed attention, encouraging public discussion and further speculation. However, without new physical evidence or confirmed testimony, the core mystery remained unchanged. The combination of incomplete records and elapsed time limited the ability to reach new conclusions. The family continued to hold on to the possibility that their children might have survived, a belief reinforced by the absence of closure. Over decades, this conviction became part of the case narrative, shaping how others perceived the events. The emotional strength required to maintain hope across such a long period reflected both parental attachment and the human need for certainty when facing unexplained loss. Institutional perspectives tended to remain consistent with the original findings. Authorities generally maintained that the fire was accidental and that the children had most likely been inside when the house was destroyed. Without evidence to contradict that conclusion, there was little basis for reopening the investigation in an official capacity. This contrast between institutional certainty and family doubt became a defining feature of the story. The passage of time also introduced generational change. As years became decades, new family members grew up hearing about the disappearance, and community memory shifted from direct experience to historical awareness. The case moved from current event into regional legend, discussed in conversations, articles and documentaries that sought to understand what might have happened. Each retelling carried elements of both fact and interpretation, reinforcing the enduring mystery. Technological advancements in forensic science that developed later in the 20th century could not easily be applied because original evidence was limited. Without preserved materials suitable for modern testing, the potential for scientific clarification remained constrained. This reality highlighted how investigative capabilities are shaped by the tools available at the time an event occurs. Ultimately, the later reviews and reassessments did not produce definitive answers. Instead, they emphasized how uncertainty can persist when evidence is incomplete and conclusions remain contested. The disappearance of the Sodder children continued to exist between tragedy and mystery, shaped by the tension between official findings and personal belief. The continuing mystery, therefore, became part of the case's legacy. Rather than fading into obscurity, it remained present in public awareness, carried forward by questions that had never been fully resolved. The story endured not because of confirmed discoveries, but because uncertainty itself became the central element, inviting reflection long after the original events had passed. Over time, the disappearance of the Sodder children became more than a single tragic event. It evolved into a lasting presence within community memory, shaping how the story was remembered across generations. In Fayette County and surrounding areas, the hillside where the house once stood remained associated with the events of Christmas 1945. For those who had lived through that period, the memory was personal, tied to neighbors, conversations, and the emotional weight of uncertainty. For the Sodder family themselves, the legacy was deeply intertwined with identity. The parents' determination to seek answers influenced how their children and later generations understood the story. Family members grew up hearing about the events, the search efforts, and the unresolved questions that followed. This continuity ensured that the disappearance remained part of family history, rather than something confined to the past. The emotional connection to the missing children persisted long after the original incident. Public reminders also played a role in shaping the legacy. The billboard displaying photographs of the children remained visible for many years, becoming a familiar landmark to travelers passing through the region. For some, it was simply an unusual roadside image, but for others, it symbolized an unanswered question that had endured across decades. The presence of those photographs reinforced the sense that the story was unfinished, inviting reflection from anyone who encountered it. Within the broader community, the case became part of local storytelling. Residents shared recollections of the night of the fire, the aftermath, and the family's ongoing search. These conversations often blended factual details with personal interpretation, as memory naturally evolves over time. The story became woven into regional history, passed along through generations who had not directly witnessed the events, but inherited their significance through retelling. Media attention contributed to the legacy as well. Newspapers, documentaries, and articles periodically revisited the case, presenting it to new audiences who had not previously heard about it. Each renewed examination brought fresh interest, even though definitive answers remained elusive. The continuing attention demonstrated how unresolved mysteries can persist within public consciousness long after the original events have faded from daily awareness. The case also illustrated broader themes about loss and uncertainty. Communities often respond to tragedy with solidarity and support, but when questions remain unanswered, the emotional impact can extend much further. The absence of closure creates a space where multiple interpretations can exist simultaneously, allowing hope and doubt to coexist. This dynamic shaped how both the family and the community related to the disappearance over time. For some observers, the story became symbolic of persistence and determination. The parents' refusal to accept incomplete answers reflected a universal human desire to understand what happens to loved ones. Their efforts to keep attention on the case demonstrated how personal conviction can sustain inquiry long after official processes have ended. This aspect of the story resonated with many people who encountered it. As decades passed, the physical traces of the event gradually disappeared. The house was gone, the hillside returned to its natural appearance, and the immediate evidence faded. Yet the memory remained, carried through photographs, written accounts, and shared recollections. The transformation from physical sight to remembered history is common in long-standing mysteries, where narrative becomes the primary connection to events that once unfolded in real time. The legacy of the Sodder Children Disappearance, therefore, exists in multiple forms. It lives within family history, community memory, and broader public awareness. It represents both tragedy and unresolved mystery, shaped by the tension between official conclusions and personal belief. The story continues not because of new discoveries, but because the questions have never fully been answered. In this way, the impact extends beyond the original moment. It reminds us how events can echo across time, influencing generations who were not present when they occurred. The disappearance became part of cultural memory, carried forward through curiosity, reflection, and the enduring human need to seek understanding even when certainty remains out of reach. As this story settles into the quiet of the night, what remains most noticeable is the space between certainty and uncertainty. A family home once stood on a hillside, filled with ordinary routines, conversations, and anticipation for a holiday morning. Within a few hours, that familiar world changed completely, leaving behind loss and questions that would never be fully resolved. Over time, the intensity of the moment softened, but the mystery itself remained, carried forward through memory rather than evidence. There is something deeply human about the need to understand what happens to those we love. When answers are incomplete, the mind continues searching, returning again and again to details, possibilities, and memories. For the Sodder family, this search became part of life itself. Their determination reflected not only hope, but the emotional bond that connects parents and children across time. Even as years passed, the absence of certainty prevented closure, allowing questions to remain present in quiet ways. Communities also carry memories in their own manner. Events become stories that are shared, revisited, and reflected upon long after the physical traces have disappeared. The hillside where the house once stood eventually returned to stillness, yet the memory of what happened there continued to exist in conversation and recollection. This transformation from lived experience to remembered history is part of how communities process events that do not have clear endings. As you rest, there is no need to search for conclusions. Some mysteries remain open, not because they demand attention, but because the information needed to resolve them was never fully known. Time moves forward regardless, and life continues around unanswered questions. The presence of uncertainty does not disturb the calm of the present moment. Instead, it simply becomes part of the larger landscape of memory. Allow the details of the story to fade gently now. The night grows quieter, the surroundings more still, and the mind can release its focus. The events belong to another time, carried forward only through reflection. In this moment, there is only calm breathing, quiet space, and the steady passage of night toward rest. The story settles softly into silence, where questions remain without urgency and memory rests peacefully, allowing sleep to come naturally as the night deepens.